Jesus is King. Hello, this is Timothy Flanders from 1 Peter 5, here with another edition of Mass Confusion with Mass of the Ages. This is part 3 of a series in which we debunk the most common misconceptions or misunderstandings about the Latin Mass. I hope you witnessed the most recent premiere from Mass of the Ages with Michael Knowles. It's been a great hit so far, so take a look at that. So today's topic is, does modern man need a simple liturgy? This is coming from one of the speeches of Paul VI that justifies the changes that came about, which created the new Mass. Now, today we're going to only be able to scratch the surface on many of the concepts that Paul VI brings out in his speech. But we're going to continue just looking at what is a liturgy according to natural law. And we're focusing on, the reason we're focusing on this is because this is the argument that we can make from the very basics of what is natural, what is rational, before we even get into what does divine revelation tell us about liturgy. So first, as we did last week, we're going to start with a concession. Before the changes to the new Mass, there were already precedents for simplification. For example, the Low Mass. The Low Mass, obviously, is a simplified liturgy compared to the High Mass. Also, there's other examples where, for example, the baptismal rite can be very simplified, or it can be sort of the fullness of the entire liturgical rite. And so we should concede that we're not arguing that there should always and everywhere be a maximal, complicated, symbolic liturgical act in every single case. Because clearly the tradition allows for various simplifications for good reasons, like pastoral necessity, baptism in case of death, for example. Obviously, we're going to simplify the rite. We're not going to go through all the steps of the symbols and everything. So there is precedent for simplification. But the question is, should we sort of assume that modernity or modern man requires the maximum amount of simplification? And that is sort of what is most required for the apostolate today. I'm going to start with the fundamental assertion of this particular Mass confusion is that we're going to talk about an aspect of the liturgy which is the symbolic aspect. The fundamental assertion of this broadcast is that all liturgies use symbols which are, by definition, not simple. A symbol is not simply that thing. It's something much more than that thing. An example, most conspicuous for everyone to relate to, obviously, is the wedding ring. You have a wedding ring, and this is not simply a ring around your finger. It's not simple. It's not a simple thing, just this thing that is attached to my finger. It's a symbol of something much deeper, much bigger, and that is one of the basic essential elements of what liturgy is. Liturgy is not simple because it's symbolic. In the liturgical example, we have the genuflection. The genuflection is not just bending over. It's a symbolic act which means so much more than just merely the thing itself. That's what a symbol is. So liturgy has as this essential element symbolism. And symbolism is not simple. That's the very nature of the thing. Now, just a reminder, we are going to get questions at the end of this talk. So if anybody has any questions, comments, feel free you can put them in the chat. We'll review them all and get all the questions at the end. Now, first, real quick, I wanted to review the conceptualization that we had last time. I know the audio was a little garbled in the beginning, so I'm just going to quickly review where we were, in that we were arguing from this passage from Summa Secunda Secundae, question 85, article 1. And this is going to be our presupposition also for our discussion about symbols. And so we're talking about what is observed by all these different on the natural level, looking at all these different religions to manifest what St. Thomas says, what is at all times and among all nations. So a liturgy is a participation in the divine, or at least an attempt at that. We talked about how liturgy is a cultus. It's a participation in a culture and a people. That all fits into this whole framework of a people where there is a cultus, which is that liturgy, which forms that whole tradition of a people. So then we talked about a sacred language. That was the subject last time. And using the same argument from St. Thomas, we can see how the use of a sacred language for the cultus is of natural law. It's very natural, it's rational, it's of the very essence of what liturgy is. And so this is the other aspect that we can get into, is that today we'll talk about a liturgy manifests the divine by sounds and symbols. So let's requote St. Thomas again, inserting what we're saying here. At all times and among all nations, there's always been the offering of sacrifices using symbols. Now that which is observed by all is seemingly natural. Therefore, using symbols is of the natural law. Secunda Secundae, question 85, article 1. So, this symbolic nature, which, as we said, symbols by their very nature are not simple. A symbol is a thing used to communicate something deeper than itself. It is not simple. A symbol is used when ordinary words and actions insufficiently communicate the depth of a thing. So, once again, I got married. And, for example, part of the marriage is you sign a marriage contract. And that's part of the, like civil aspect of marriage, where you are recognized as a legal entity. So you sign a paper, and that's kind of the plain language of a marriage. That's the plain language. Paul VI talks about modern man wants plain language. Okay, fine. We've got plain language for my marriage. I signed a paper. There it is. But this wedding ring is a symbol, because the plain language is insufficient to communicate the depth of the thing. It's not merely this contract. It's something much deeper than that. You wear a wedding ring on your left hand because your left hand is closer to your heart. Wedding ring is circular. It goes on forever, in a sense. It goes around and around and around. It's a bond that it's always stuck to you. You never really, you take it off sometimes, but you don't take off your wedding ring. You have it on forever. All these different symbolic things, because a symbol is used to communicate something which is deeper than itself when ordinary words and actions are insufficient. That's the very nature of a symbol. And so we see that a liturgy, that's why a liturgy utilizes symbols. So a genuflection is a symbol, as we said. We don't merely say, glory to God in the highest, or we don't merely use plain language like the catechism. We don't go into the liturgy and just read the catechism. We don't say that God is omnipotent, God is transcendent, God is almighty. All these things that are true, that would be the plain language. We actually do them by genuflecting. We do these truths. That is why the liturgy manifests the divine using sounds and symbols. So, here are some examples of symbols in liturgies by natural law. These are all different liturgies across the world. They all have these things. This is what we can determine based on that same principle from St. Thomas. These are the different symbols that a liturgy should have. And notice that each and every one of these is not plain language, because plain language is insufficient. We're going to have plain language, that's true, yes. But we also have those symbols. So, number one, sacred language. Sacred language itself is a symbol. It symbolizes all of the things that we talked about last time. Chant. What is chant? It's a sacred music. Music itself is a symbol. We don't just say something, it becomes a music, and hearing something is a symbolic thing. It's something that's manifesting something to transcend it to itself. Another thing, silence. Silence itself is a symbol as well. Another symbol which communicates something deeper than itself. And then number 4, movements. We talked about genuflecting. There's also movements in the traditional Roman Rite. There's obviously there's a procession in. There's movements. Everyone's genuflecting. We have the movements of the altar boys and the priest. These very methodical movements where you see, for example, here's another movement in the traditional Roman Rite. One of my favorite symbols is the moving of the gospel. So after the epistle is read on the south side of the altar, so on the right side if you're looking at the altar boy takes the gospel book and he comes to the middle and he genuflects in the middle. Again, that symbol. And then he brings the gospel book to the north side of the altar, and that's where the priest reads the gospel. In a high mass, the gospel book is actually moved quite a bit to the left, which is to the north. Now, why is the gospel read to the north? Well, it's because the direction of the north in the Roman Rite was understood to be the direction of darkness. And if you think about it historically, if you're in Rome and you go north, you hit the barbarians. That's the borders of the Roman Empire are to the north. So the north that's the place of darkness, barbarity, pagan invasions coming into our civilized Roman Empire and destroying our civilization. Later on, you had the invasion of the Vikings, and the church actually added, and they were called the Northmen. So the church added this petition to its liturgy, God deliver us from the Northmen. So that's why the gospel is pointed towards the north. So it's this powerful symbol that we are proclaiming the gospel towards the darkness. We're proclaiming the gospel towards the pagan tribes. So that's an example of a movement. We're moving the gospel book. We're not just saying that in plain language. Plain language is insufficient. We don't just read the catechism. We have to actually do the catechism, do the faith. And that's what liturgy is doing. So let's continue. What are some other symbols in all liturgies? We also have materials. We have things that are used. Obviously, in the Blessed Sacrament, we have bread and wine, which are materials, and they're not just things that God created, but they're things that man also created. And those things, that very fact is also symbolic. All of these things are very deeply symbolic. So we have materials. Things are used in the actual ritual universally. And then we have smells, of course. We have incense. Incense is very universally used in all sorts of different religions. We also have tastes. There is a tasting of the sacred bread. We have in the Old Testament, we had the eating of the sacrifices, and in the New Testament, obviously the eating of the new sacrifice, the new covenant. And finally, and this is not an exhaustive list. We just have 8 main symbols, but there's many other symbols that we could draw from. Another is the architecture. The architecture for the liturgy is also itself a symbol. In the Christian rituals, the church is a symbol of the entire cosmos. That's why you'll often have in our diocesan cathedral, you have stars on the roof of the nave, which is so all of this is a symbol. So the church building itself is a symbol of the entire cosmos, and the entire cosmos is a symbol of a temple. Because Adam and Eve were born, they were given, right? Sorry, not Adam and Eve were not born, but they were created to be priests in the temple. Adam is the priest in the temple of the entire world. The cosmos itself is a temple. And all of this, the world itself is a temple, the church is a temple, all of this, the architecture. So this is the architecture, another symbolic aspect of the liturgy. So you have all of these different things The common factor here is that these are not simple, plain language. It's symbolic language, is what it is. It's symbolic language. We're speaking with symbols because ordinary speech is insufficient to communicate the depth of the thing. So, in a way, liturgy, because it is essential to have symbols in the liturgy, in any liturgy, it is by its very nature not plain language. So there's a certain contradiction, I think, in the very premise here given by Pope Paul VI in saying that our liturgies should become plain language, because it's almost like saying modern man is not liturgical, modern man is not symbolic. Symbols penetrate the whole of man with all five senses. So all of the different symbols we just discussed are all the different senses. When we talk in plain language, there are words that we use, but even in plain language, there's also body language. There's nonverbal language that one communicates. There's all sorts of other symbolic things, even in your everyday life. But with the liturgy needs to penetrate the whole man and needs to connect with man in this visceral way, which connects with his five senses and lifts up those senses to something transcendent. That is the reason for symbols, that we use symbols. And also, we can talk about symbols that are used not in liturgy. We talked about the wedding ring, which is sort of, I'm not celebrating a liturgy when I wear a wedding ring, but there's also other symbols that are used for civic purposes, for governmental purposes, to commemorate various things. There's symbols used all over the place. And symbols are by nature not simple. That's what makes them symbols. So, Paul VI believed modern man preferred everyday language, that modern man tends against symbolic depth. But we're arguing here that symbols, by their very nature, are not simple. They're not plain language. This is a rhetorical question, but does modern man still have five senses? Have his senses been altered? Has the natural law been altered? And this is we can concede that there can be various pastoral necessities which require various simplifications, as we said in the beginning, and even various time periods. And certainly modernity is a particular time period which has particular pastoral needs. But what we saw with both the official implementation of the new Mass, as well as sort of the on-the-ground implementation, because we can contrast sort of what is the new Mass on paper, and what is the new Mass in the concrete, in your everyday. Somebody said in the beginning, Saint typical parish. Well, what you have is a trend against the symbolic. It's sort of an attempt to maximize the simplification, minimize the symbolic content. But this is, if liturgy itself, by its very essence, is symbolic, by reducing everything as much as possible to reduce all of the symbols, it is reducing the very nature of liturgy. It's reducing the liturgical aspect of the liturgy. So, let's continue. We talked about last time, these are all the different aspects that the sacred language communicates. But since sacred language is itself a symbol, these are all the different aspects that symbols participate in. They communicate mystery, transcendence, reverence, antiquity, ancestors. You communicate with the way that your ancestors used these symbols. there's a universality, and as well as the clerical priesthood. The clerical priesthood itself is a symbol. So there's all these different aspects and depth to the concept of symbols, which all of these things, I mean, none of these things, really, is there any of these 7 things that is really plain language? All of these things are transcendent concepts which you enter into by means of these symbols. So, those are some of the aspects that we have talked about today. So I'm going to get to your questions. First, just a reminder to donate to latinmass.com/give. This is for the Mass of the Ages. The Mass of the Ages is so much more than just a trilogy, as you saw in the most recent release with Michael Knowles explaining the Latin Mass in 5 levels of difficulty. There are millions of people who have already seen the Mass of the Ages trilogy, and the 3rd part is coming up soon. But also, reminder: the director's cut of episode 1 is coming on Guadalupe Day in December. But Mass of the Ages aims to be the front porch of the Latin Mass, to introduce everyone to the Latin Mass. And this is something that helps all Latin Mass communities. In particular, LatinMass.com is developing priest training videos. And this is going to help spread the Latin Mass even further, so that ordinary diocesan priests who are out there who want to learn the Latin Mass but never had access to this type of thing are going to have access to it via LatinMass.com. So please help us double the Latin Masses worldwide plus LatinMass.com/give. And also as a reminder, the spiritual component of this is the Crusade of Eucharistic Reparation. This is our collaboration with 1 Peter 5 and Mass of the Ages. And you can go to 1peter5.com/crusade. That is our lay sodality. You can get invested in the Crusader Cross, which I'm wearing right here. This is a sacramental, which is, there's a ritual that we adapted from the old Crusader rites, where you get invested with the cross. You can get invested with this Crusader Cross. And the requirements are very minimal. Just go to 1peter5.com/crusade. That is the show. That's what we're all about. So, your questions. Let's take a look at the chat. Let me see. Oh, my battery power is dying. Okay, there we go. All right. So, Anthony says, I really miss the Gregorian chant. Yes. Cameron says, would love to hear Timothy talk about his proposed solution for an English extraordinary form, unless there's a future show. Yeah, we'll definitely cover that on a future show, but I do think that this is at least one option to help a lot of the issues, I think, which is allowing certain vernacular, as long as it is a sacred form of the vernacular, sacred vernacular forms of the Latin Mass, or the Mass of Pius V, if you will. This is something that this is more or less allowed in the Anglican Ordinariate. But these various vernacular translations have already been approved because there's been these missals. So, we'll talk more about that in a future broadcast. Cat named Mouse 1 says, the move to simplify removed the requirement for both the parishioners and the clergy to take seriously the sacrifice of the Mass. A direct result is the lack of belief in the real presence. Yes, this is something that we certainly have a sensitivity towards, that we want to help promote through the Crusade of Eucharistic Reparation. Even in the best Novus Ordo Masses, I desperately miss the silence in the Roman canon. Yes, if you're praying the Roman canon, it is a lot of words and not a lot of silence if it's out loud. John says, you could probably also add the way we present ourselves and dress. Veils for the ladies. Yeah, that's a great point, of course, John. The way we dress is also a symbol, a very important symbol indeed. And we also have that dress symbol when we do other things, like when we attend a wedding, we don't just come up in jeans and a t-shirt, or when we had an audience with the Pope or an audience with the president, various things like that. We would dress better, or going to a funeral. These are all symbolic acts, which means something. What does that mean when you are dressing nicely? It means that I respect what's going on here. I respect the persons that are doing this thing, or that I'm meeting. I'm showing my respect and honor to this thing, and this is a symbol. Let me take a look at other questions. John says, what do you mean by a clerical priesthood? What I mean is there is a class of people, just according to the natural law in all liturgies, there's a class of people who are priests. And these are people who are specially designated to celebrate this liturgy, to celebrate the cultus, and they are clerical. They become clerics. They're separate than everybody else. And so the use of the sacred language, the use of symbols, these are things that manifest the fact that there's a clerical priesthood. And so the priesthood then itself, the priesthood itself is a symbol. So let me take a look at any further questions. Let me see. Here's a question for Cameron, who's in the chat. Will episode 3 be shown in theaters? And Cameron says, yes, episode 3 will be premiering in theaters early next year. So stay tuned for episode 3. Very exciting. I don't know about the free popcorn. It probably depends on your theater. Let me see. Dominic says, I've been waiting for the third for so long. Yes, haven't we all? It's going to be worth the wait. Trad Thomas says, friendly reminder to be praying your rosaries every day. God love you. Excellent. Joseph says, is Reform of the Reformed doomed? Even the conservative Novus Ordo priests seem to hem and haw over the documents of liturgical propriety. Well, I think it does depend on who you talk to. Here at the Mass of the Ages, we promote the Latin Mass as kind of the solution to all of these things. Me personally, I would not be opposed. I mean, I think everyone should be in favor of, at least at the very minimum, a reform of the reform in the sense of all of the Novus Ordos need to be cleaned up. Obviously, we need to stop so many different abuses, and at least having, at the very bare minimum, having a reverent Novus Ordo, which is by the book according to all the rules. No communion in the hand, altar rails, etc., all that, no female altar boys, all that stuff. So it's very important that that's a bare minimum. Now, trads or Mass of the Ages in general, I mean, people would disagree as to the exact solution. Should we abolish the Novus Ordo and put in the Latin Mass for everybody? Should we allow them to exist side by side, like the Summorum Pontificum solution, the mutual enrichment solution? Should we introduce new rites? That would be my preference. I think we should mandate, at the very minimum, we should mandate the Reverent Novus Ordo. We should mandate the Latin Mass in every diocese, and we should also introduce as an option a vernacular Tridentine Mass as well. I think that should be an option too. I think the most important thing is to not abolish the Latin Mass. That's the most important thing. You need to at least have the option. I think that's the most important thing about this. Trad Thomas says Dominican rite supremacy. Yeah, should we abolish all the other rites of the Latin rite? Let's see. Here's another comment from Cameron says, we don't know where the premieres can happen, but anyone can rent a copy of the film for a few $100, price to be determined, and also host a premiere with the team for a bigger price. Excellent. And I think we got one last question here from Seta in Latin. How to deal with sedevacantists that use this trimming of the Mass to declare the Pope heretic? Well, we don't have time to deal with the question of sedevacantism totally, but first of all, we have the fact that the trimming of the liturgy took place. The most dramatic trimming of the liturgy, the first dramatic trimming of the liturgy was under Pius X, when he trimmed the liturgy of the office, and he created almost out of nothing an entirely new schema for the Psalter in the Roman Rite, and essentially abolished centuries-old tradition regarding the public liturgy of the Church of the Divine Office. So that was really the first time we had a serious, kind of a violent rupture. And again, this is another point where trads disagree. We might disagree about was that prudent or not, but in any case, it was certainly a very strong rupture in terms of liturgical organic development. And then we had the 1955 reform under Pius XII. So we already have very significant trimming that's happening in both of these pontificates. So my first question for a sede would say, well, why don't you question these other popes then, if you're going to question Paul VI? It seems to me a much more consistent position is the traditional sort of recognize and resist position, which would argue, as I would argue, that there should be an organic development, and we would take some critical issue between these three different radical, rupturous liturgical changes, one under Pius X, Pius XII, and Paul VI. That would be my opinion. I respect other opinions along those lines, but the other factor here is essentially that there simply is no definitive magisterial clarification about when and how does the Pope lose his office. That has not been definitively decided by any church authority ever. And so if someone is going to come along and say, well, the Pope is a heretic or XYZ, and therefore he has lost his office, you are arguing from your own personal private opinion, because the church authority has not declared that to be the case. The theologians and the saints have had various opinions. There's different opinions as to that particular question, and it's always been sort of a hypothetical. So we can't really base a definitive decision about that, as the sedes seem to do. We can simply conjecture or hypothesize about what might be the case, but we can't make a definitive decision. So hope that helps. This is Mass Confusion, episode 3. Next week, stay tuned. We're going to be talking about oral culture. That is a very, very important aspect to this whole question that is very difficult to understand. So we're going to continue to try to unpack the very basics and essence of what is liturgy according to natural law, and then we will be delving into the particulars of the revelation in the Old Testament and the New Testament regarding what is liturgy according to divine revelation. And all of these things will help us look at the liturgical debates in the Roman Rite. So that's all we have today. Thanks so much for watching. Once again, go to latinmass.com/give. Thanks a lot. God bless.